the 2010 Atlanta Press Club Debates, brought to you live from Georgia Public Broadcasting. Now, the race for U.S. Senate.
Good evening. I'm Morris Diggs, reporter for WAGA-TV Fox 5 Atlanta. We'd like to welcome our viewers, our listeners on GPB Radio, and our live studio audience to the 2010 Atlanta Press Club Debate Series, originating from the studios of GPB. This is a debate among the candidates for U.S. Senate. Now, let's meet the candidates. They are in alphabetical order. Chuck Donovan is the Libertarian nominee and is currently flying in his 23rd year as an airline pilot and has spent over 30 years in the aviation industry. Johnny Isakson, the Republican incumbent, was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2004. Prior to being a U.S. Senator, he was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 3 terms. Mike Thurmond is the Democratic nominee and is serving his 3rd term as Georgia Labor Commissioner. Our format tonight, in the first round of the debates, the candidates will each answer a question from one of our 3 panelists. In the second round, each candidate will ask 2 questions of the opponent of his choice. There will be an opportunity for rebuttal in this round. And in the third round, the panelists will continue questioning the candidates. Finally, each candidate will have 60 seconds to make a closing statement. Before we get started, let's meet our 3 panelists, selected by the Atlanta Press Club. First, we have Meredith Anderson, news anchor for WRDW-TV, News 12 Augusta. Next, we have Jim Galloway, who's a writer and editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And our final panelist is Lori Geary, reporter for WSB-TV Channel 2 Action News in Atlanta. Now, let's get started with the debate. In the first round, the candidates will be asked a question by one of our panelists. The candidate will have 60 seconds to answer the question. Meredith Anderson asked the first question of Mike Thurmond.
You've said your experience as labor commissioner would serve you well in the Senate because jobs are a top priority, not just in Georgia, but really everywhere right now. When you look at Georgia's unemployment rate, though, right now, it's not exactly a number that a lot of us are proud of. Would you agree?
Yes, Georgia's 10% unemployment rate is unacceptable. However, as labor commissioner, I've created innovative strategies to help Georgians get back to work. The one I'm most proud of is our Georgia Works initiative that is being emulated all across this country. 30 states have called to get information about Georgia Works. 63% of the people who enroll get back to work. Tomorrow morning, when Georgians go to work, more than 4,000 Georgians will go to work, 2 jobs, as a result of participation in Georgia Works. I want to take the Georgia Works strategy to Washington, develop an America Works program, and I'm convinced that if given the opportunity based on our record here in Georgia, we can enroll 1 million Americans in Georgia Works, and within 90 days, 600,000 Americans who are unemployed will have full-time jobs.
Thank you very much. Now, Jim Galloway has a question for Chuck Donovan.
Mr. Donovan, you have a radio ad that expresses worry that we still have U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Are you advocating a withdrawal from each country? How quickly do you want to achieve that? And are you worried that this might have an unhealthy effect on U.S. policy?
Thank you, Mr. Galloway, for that question. And thank you to the Atlanta Press Club for inviting me here today. I'm glad to finally be here with Senator Isakson for the one and only debate that he's decided to fit into his schedule. I am concerned about U.S. troops still in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have achieved our military objectives there, and we've essentially set up 2 new welfare states that American taxpayers are on the hook to pay for. As far as American policy and safety, I think that our security and safety would be better served by withdrawing the troops as soon as it would be safe for them to withdraw, get them back home, get them ready for the next deployment or the next threat that we find. But a massive deployment to Iraq and Afghanistan is no longer necessary. We've made it clear, particularly in Iraq, with our $1 billion embassy there that's costing us $100 million a month to operate, that we don't intend to leave. I'd like to change that policy.
Thank you. Lori Geary, your question for Mr. Isakson.
Senator Isakson, you voted against the stimulus plan and you voted against President Obama's health care plan, but you did vote for TARP. Do you think that was a mistake now?
I voted against the stimulus plan, and I did vote against the health care plan. I voted for the first phase of TARP, which was $350 billion to stabilize the financial system in America. I then voted against the $350 billion that went into buying Chrysler and buying General Motors stock. I voted against Tim Geithner's confirmation for Secretary of the Treasury because he gave $85 billion to AIG. I think we should have never gotten into investing in those companies, which is why in each and every one of those cases I voted against that legislation. In terms of stabilizing the financial system, that was the right thing to do.
That concludes round one. It's now time for our candidates to ask a question of the opponent of his choice. They will have 30 seconds for the question, 60 seconds for the answer, and 30 seconds for a rebuttal. By random selection, Mike Thurmond asks the first question.
My first question is for Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan, on your website and in media reports, you have been very critical of Mr. Isakson's vote for TARP, and you have accused him of not being a true conservative. Is that a fair criticism, and if so, why?
Thank you, Mr. Thurmond, for that question. First of all, I want to make it clear I would have voted against TARP and bailouts for banks, bailouts by the government for banks with taxpayer money. What the government does when it steps into these things, it picks the winners and the losers in business. And when it does that, we all lose. What we never speak about when we talk about these bailouts, when we talk about government interference, we never talk about where the money is coming from. And it's coming from American workers and American taxpayers. It's taking jobs away from Americans. Government has no right to do these things. If it had an understanding of the free market, if it understood that where jobs come from is business, not government, then it would not step into these things. It should not have interfered. And I think that I'm correct in saying that this is not the fiscal conservative thing to do.
Mr. Thurmond, would you like a rebuttal?
No.
Okay. Mr. Donovan, your question now for one of your opponents.
Well, we're still staying on TARP and on big spending. And Senator Isakson, you are sounding like a fiscal conservative, but your record of votes rings up to about $19 to $20 trillion extra spending that you said yes to. You said yes to No Child Left Behind. You said yes to the Bridge to Nowhere. You said yes to the Ted Kennedy Memorial. And then without reading the bill, you said yes to the TARP. Now, sir, I'd like to know where in the Constitution it authorizes us to step in and do that kind of spending.
Well, first of all, in terms of what I didn't read, I read every bit of the original TARP when it was brought by President Bush and Secretary Paulson, number one. Number two, I think I've got a long history of conservative votes fiscally going back to 1976 when I was first elected to the legislature. Georgia's privatization law, which took Georgia out of the business of golf courses and swimming pools and privatized a lot of those parks, that was Isakson's amendment in the United States Senate. In the House of Representatives, I worked hard to limit the budget spending in the Georgia House of Representatives. In the U.S. House, I was the one that brought parity to the Highway Trust Fund to see to it we weren't borrowing by spending money on bond debt, but instead by only using the user fees that went in there. So I think I've got a long, successful history of voting conservative. I ran a small business. I understand what it's like to meet a payroll. I understand what it's like to have to borrow a payroll on Thursday to make it on Friday. I don't want to be borrowing from our children's future any more than you do, Chuck.
You can have a rebuttal if you'd like.
Thank you, Morris. Sir, you gave 75 consecutive yes votes for extra spending during 2001-2004, at a time when we knew that the baby boomers were coming along and they were going to be very difficult to pay for in these entitlements that we promised them. You said yes 75 times in a row when we should have been saving money. What your record shows, sir, is that as long as there is a Democrat in the White House and a Democratic majority in the Senate and in the House, we can rely upon you to be a fiscal conservative. But when there are Republican majorities, like we're looking at right now, you are a big spender and a big government kind of representative.
Mr. Isakson, you can now ask your question of any of the candidates.
Michael, and when you and I served in the legislature before, we had the luxury of having a budget cap. In fact, you couldn't do deficit spending because Georgia's Constitution won't allow it. Congress, I voted for the balanced budget amendment, but unfortunately we couldn't get 2/3 to do it. So I've introduced the biennial budget, which requires appropriations in odd-numbered years and oversight and cuts in even-numbered years, the years when everybody's running for re-election. What would you propose in the Senate of the United States as a cap or a restriction on spending?
Well, first of all, we have to get control of our deficit and out-of-control spending. It's often been said that our representatives in Washington and our senators spend our money like drunken sailors. The truth is some of those sailors have been Democrats, but a whole lot of them been Republicans too. So what I'm saying is that as your next U.S. Senator, we should go with pay-go. We should not spend money we don't have. We should look at the realities that Georgia families are facing. They don't have the luxury of purchasing food and shelter and clothing because they don't have the money, and we need to make sure we have that same fiscal discipline in Washington.
Okay, Mr. Thurmond, you get a chance to ask a second question.
Well, my question is to Mr. Donovan again. Mr. Donovan, there are 500,000 unemployed Georgians today. Half of those Georgians are receiving unemployment insurance benefits. Half of those Georgians have been unemployed for at least 6 months. If you are elected to the U.S. Senate, will you support legislation that will provide extended benefits for those who've lost their job through no fault of their own?
Thank you, Mr. Thurmond. I think it's important that we emphasize that jobs do not come from government. Government is the expensive roadblock in the way of those who actually do create jobs. And as long as government continues to create more roadblocks, we will continue to lose jobs or never regain the ones we have lost. We have to get out of the way of business. We have to trust business. We have to remember that government is never the solution. Government, sir, is always the problem. We like to talk about the people that we take care of. That's a nice thing. But we never talk about where the money comes from. And it comes from people who are working. It's coming out of their pockets right now, and they're seeing what happens each month. They're running out of money before they run out of month. Working Americans are doing this. They're honest Americans. They're all trying to do the right thing. But as you continue to spend more money at the government level, you take buying power out of their hands. I'm trying to put that back in their hands. I want to go to Washington and divest Washington of the power that it has usurped, that it has stolen from the people of Georgia and Americans.
A rebuttal, if you'd like.
Yes, I think on behalf of the unemployed men and women in this state who've lost their job through no fault of their own, I want to reaffirm my commitment to you. When you lost your job during this very hard recession, I was there. If you will elect me as your next U.S. Senator, you will have a voice in Washington who feels your pain, who understands the challenges that you're facing, and who will make getting America back to work our #1 priority. We had enough money to bail out Wall Street, but we couldn't find the few quarters needed to help hard-working men and women. We had enough money to take care of the stockholders at J.P. Morgan, but we couldn't help the community bankers who've invested in these small institutions. I will be there for the people of Georgia.
Okay. Mr. Isakson, forgive me, I looked at you on your question. I didn't see that you had a rebuttal, but if you do have, if you want to cover that, we'll have plenty of time for that. We want to acknowledge that. Mr. Donovan, now, your second question.
Thank you, Morris. Senator Isakson, you are in your advertisements telling the Georgia voters, reminding them that you voted no for Justices Kagan and Sotomayor. And I want you to know I would have voted no for them as well, for different reasons, but I would have voted no for them as well. However, you voted yes for Cass Sunstein and Eric Holder, who is now our Attorney General. Cass Sunstein, a well-known Marxist. Eric Holder, who thinks that the UN ought to take guns away from American citizens. I'd like to know why you voted yes for those two gentlemen.
Well, first of all, your information is incorrect on Cass Sunstein. In fact, on national television, I was brought forward because I'm the person that put a hold in the Senate. You can put a hold. And I put a hold for 3 weeks on Cass Sunstein until the majority, with 60 votes, brought him to the floor, where I voted against him. So I don't know where that information's come from, but it's just incorrect. As far as Holder is concerned, I interviewed him before the appointment vote. I talked to two distinguished Georgians for whom I have a great deal of respect, Larry Thompson being one of them, Griffin Bell the other. They gave him high marks. I have been disappointed in what he did with Guantanamo detainees, and I think that's unfortunate. But your information is just incorrect on Cass Sunstein.
Rebuttal?
If my information is incorrect, sir, then I appreciate your no vote on Cass Sunstein. I would have voted no for him as well. For Eric Holder, I would have voted no for him also. As I said, he thinks that the United Nations ought to take control of personal weapons here in the United States, and I think that is a complete usurpation of U.S. power here.
Okay, Mr. Isakson, you have a question, a second question for round two. And if you'd like, if there was a point from the earlier question that you want to wrap up to in the response, take that opportunity now before you ask your question.
I'll go ahead and ask my question, if that's all right.
All right.
And I'll ask it of Michael Thurmond. Michael, Judge Magnuson, about 18 months ago, made a very significant ruling on the tri-state water wars between Georgia, Alabama, and Florida that had been going on since August of 1990. I've introduced legislation to address the concerns from the congressional standpoint that Judge Magnuson has raised to Georgia. What would you do in the United States Senate to address that ruling by Judge Magnuson and the Tri-State Water Compact?
Thank you, Senator. Actually, I reviewed the 4 bills you did introduce just this afternoon before I came. What's missing in the resolution of the water crisis here in Georgia is leadership. Leadership in Washington as well as leadership here in our state. What I would do is that I would form a water caucus in Washington, bringing together a bipartisan group of people to work on this important and serious issue. What we need to recognize is that also there are things we must do even while we wait for this to be resolved in courts. We can conserve more by improving our infrastructure in cities and counties. We can do more in terms of creating reservoirs in our state. And most importantly of all, we can recognize that this issue is about all Georgians, Republicans, Democrats, North, South, East, and West. We need leadership that will build winning bipartisan coalitions so that we can make sure we have water, not just to maintain ourselves, but to create prosperity in the future.
Mr. Isakson.
Well, it's also about more than just Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, because in the research we did following Judge Magnuson's ruling, 17 states with 43 impoundments, and including the territory of Puerto Rico, all don't have water supply as a designated use within their charter, which is why they are using it for water supply now. So not only do we in Georgia have a problem in Atlanta, but you're right, it is a 17-state problem, 43 reservoir problem, that if it's not addressed, there are going to be a lot of municipalities not in water supply anymore.
Thank you very much. Now, that concludes our second round. For those who may be joining our program in progress, this is the debate among the candidates for U.S. Senate. For our third round, we return to our panel of journalists who will ask questions of the candidate of his or her choice. The candidate will be allowed 60 seconds to respond. As moderator, I will determine if a rebuttal is necessary. We begin this round with a question from Ms. Anderson.
I would like to ask Senator Isakson a question. You've had some health issues this year. You were hospitalized twice in March and then in April for a heart problem and a blood clot. How would you respond to people who say you're not healthy enough to serve in Washington?
Well, I haven't had anybody say that, but since you're the first, I'll give you my off the top of my head answer. If you go on the internet, which I imagine you have, all the reports of my health condition that happened in March are all on the internet for you to read. What I did was I had a reaction to an infection in my bloodstream, and when I stayed in the hospital 3 days lying stationary where I had an IV, I got a blood clot in my leg, which is a pretty normal thing to happen to somebody. So I'm in great health, the best health I've been in a long time. In fact, I've lost about 18 pounds, feel great, having a good time, and that's the first time anybody's questioned my health. So all I can tell you is go to the internet and see what the doctors say.
Jim Galloway, now your question.
Gentlemen, this is one for all three of you. We've heard a great deal of talk condemning the use of earmarks in the federal budget process. What in Georgia is worth an earmark? Is it the dredging of the Port of Savannah? Is it a new VA hospital up in North Georgia? Mr. Thurmond, we'll start with you.
First of all, I think what a senator must do is weigh priorities. We should avoid earmarks, but luckily the U.S. Senate and Congress now requires that the secretness of earmarks be removed. So when an earmark is granted, you will be able to go and find out who actually requested the earmark. I think I would weigh that. The dredging of the Savannah Harbor is such an important issue. I've said before that I will make that my #1 economic development priority. If, in fact, as a U.S. Senator, I have the opportunity to secure funding for the Savannah Harbor, I'm going to do it, even if it's with an earmark, and I'll be proud to do so.
Mr. Isakson.
Well, I appreciate Jim asking that question because it's an important question. The transparency that Michael's talking about that's now required in Congress is a part of the Isakson amendment that took place on earmarks 3 years ago, where we forced them to go on the Internet so everybody can see firsthand what members of the Senate and House have requested. Secondly, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution designates congressional responsibility for ports and for the Army and the Navy. So I think in both cases that you stated, a veterans hospital like the one at Claremont, which recently got a $21 million expansion, or the Port of Savannah, which will not be competitive at the end of 2014 if we don't meet the demands that are brought on us by the widening and deepening of the Panama Canal, are absolutely legitimate for the health, safety, welfare, and the best interest of the people of Georgia.
And Mr. Donovan.
Thank you. There is no authorization for earmarks. There is no reason to be using earmarks. They should be directly voted on bills. I'm glad you bring up the VA hospital system, though, because especially while we continue to make more wounded veterans, as a veteran who, while I was recovering from cancer, I was tossed out of the VA hospital. They couldn't serve me anymore. I understand this problem. There is a program called Champus for civilians in the military, and there is a program called VA Champ, which would allow veterans to be served by more hospitals than just the VA system. The VA system is in trouble. The VA hospital system is in trouble. I'd like to see that VA Champ system expanded, and we'll look at doing better spending on the VA hospital system.
Now, Lori Geary will ask a question.
This is for all three of you, but I'd like to hear from Mr. Thurmond first. President Obama talks about not raising taxes on middle-class folks, and the threshold is he won't raise taxes on single folks making less than $200,000 a year, $250,000 a year for couples. Are those acceptable thresholds in your mind?
My position is that we should not raise taxes on any American during a recession. I'm proud of my record as a tax cutter here in Georgia. As a member of the General Assembly, I passed legislation that has provided over $300 million in tax relief for senior citizens and working families. As Labor Commissioner, I've led the effort to reduce employer taxes by more than $1 billion. I think a smart tax strategy, a tax code that rewards entrepreneurship and achievement, a tax strategy that closes loopholes that reward companies who ship American jobs overseas is the right approach. I believe that we should only raise taxes when it's absolutely necessary, and in this economy, it's not necessary.
Okay, Meredith Anderson has the next question.
This is for all three of you, and Mr. Donovan, you could start. Before I came here, I'm here representing the Augusta area.
Excuse me, I cut off the other. You had a question to all three. I'm sorry. Mr. Isakson, you answer that question.
Well, absolutely. I do not think you ought to raise taxes. In fact, what we ought to do is make permanent the existing tax rates as they are, and specifically with regard to the question of $200,000 and $250,000. I'm on the Small Business Committee. There are 800,000 small businesses in the United States of America who pay their taxes as an individual because of the way they're organized, and they make more than $200,000 or $250,000. So you'd be talking about raising the taxes on 800,000 businesses that provide the jobs that all of us are looking for to be provided for Americans. The worst thing to do in this time of recession would be to tax small business greater than it already is right now. We ought to keep the rates where they are.
Okay, Mr. Donovan.
I agree the rates should be kept where they are, and the economy is basically on its back. We don't want to kick it while it's down and increase taxes to make the situation worse. The tax code is 67,500 pages. It doesn't work. We have the highest tax rate, corporate tax rate in the developed world. But talking about taxes is only half of the equation. We can lower taxes, we can eliminate a whole bunch more taxes, but until we lower spending and significantly, substantially lower spending at the federal level, no tax program is going to work. So yes, we should keep the rates where they are right now, but we need to concentrate on cutting spending at the federal level.
Okay, now Meredith Anderson, let's have your question.
Take two. I'll start with Mr. Donovan, but again, this is a question for all three of you. I came from the Augusta area here today. I'm representing the population there, and I put out a request for our viewers to send us some questions, and we do have a military presence. Fort Gordon's right outside of Augusta, and this is a question that I got from someone, one of our viewers. This is from Aaron. He says, I'm a United States Marine with 3 tours under my belt. I have 2 Purple Hearts, and I am only 27 years old. I am also gay and lost my lover who was in the Army in Iraq. What do you think about Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
Thank you for that question, Meredith. I'm also a Marine, a peacetime Marine, so I really respect our combat Marines and other troops. Don't ask, don't tell is something that could have been taken care of with a simple order from the Commander-in-Chief. Instead, it was passed around like a political football during an election year. I think Barry Goldwater said it best when he said that we don't have to worry about whether or not our soldiers are straight as long as they can shoot straight. I think it's great that there are people who are volunteering during wartime, and I think we should celebrate that. I think we should notice that there is a thing called the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And this is something that allows commanders to do what they need to do, which is to maintain morale, unit cohesiveness, and unit readiness. Congress's job is not to be meddling with people's private lives. They're supposed to be overlooking the commanders in our military, if we trust them, overlooking them, watching them to make sure that the UCMJ is being properly administered.
Mr. Isakson.
I think we should trust our military and our commanders as to make the decisions in terms of the military. President Obama, when this question came up, said he was going to commission all of his heads of staff, General McMullen, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to make their recommendation. And then before they even made their recommendation, there started being a politicization of the decision. I think it should be left to the commanders in the field, and they should make the determination.
And Mr. Thurmond.
Well, first, I want to categorically state that I oppose any type of discrimination, particularly discrimination that may be based on sexual orientation. We need to recognize that they are true, brave, loyal Americans who are gay and who make great contributions to this nation in the military and without. I also, at the end of the day, believe that we should leave this decision to our military commanders. They know best how to lead and to prepare our military, and I would support their decision on this important and critical issue.
Okay, Jim Galloway, your next question.
Another question for all three of you. We'll start with Mr. Isakson. Gentlemen, the health care reform legislation passed by Congress this spring, repeal, replace, or improve? Do we go back to the status quo ante, including rejection of coverage for pre-existing conditions, or do we move toward a state-oriented solution like that established by Mitt Romney when he was governor of Massachusetts?
Well, first of all, I think you repeal the existing law that has just passed on Christmas Eve of last year, and then you start over. There are things we can do to make health care more affordable and more accessible for the American people. People talk about Republicans just saying no. In fact, we just said yes to a proposal that we offered. If you watch the debate in the Blair House between the President and the leadership of the Republican caucus, it was quite clear that we offered all the types of solutions that make a difference to make the private sector be a part of the solution rather than drive everybody to a single-payer government system like this health care bill does. So you repeal it. You go to the drawing board, you allow insurance to be sold across state lines, risk pools to be formed across state lines, do those things that empower and bring up coverage to those people who no longer are covered, but don't put the government in charge of health care for every single person and move the private sector out.
Mr. Thurmond, health care reform?
If you repeal it, you take away important job tax credits for small business. If you repeal it, as it is now, there are children with pre-existing illnesses who will not have access to health care. If you repeal it, you will reopen the hole to the donut, and there are thousands, millions of senior citizens who will not be able to afford their medication. I say you improve it. You improve it by reforming the 1099 provision in terms of reporting taxes for small business. You improve it by allowing us to negotiate with drug prescription companies so that we can get a better price. At the end of the day, it will be difficult to achieve anything in Washington simply because of the hyper-partisanship. As your next U.S. Senator, I want to say this to the people of Georgia. As your Senator, I will not be a person who will say no just because a good idea originated with a Republican, who even will say yes just because it came from a Democrat. I will go to represent the people of Georgia, not Republicans, Democrats, or Libertarians, but the people of this great state.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan, tackle health care.
Thank you. Romney Care, as we know, as we observe in Massachusetts, is actually raising the rates to health care insurance in Massachusetts faster than any other state in the union. Obamacare is basically Romney Care for all 50 states. I understand what pre-existing conditions means. I've had that. I've had to deal with it when I needed health care the most. I didn't have it. I had to go to the VA hospital, and then I got dumped from the VA hospital. The problem here is that government keeps raising the rates raising the price of health care, making it more expensive. That's our problem. We need to get the price down. We're not going to do that by making the government get more involved in health care. Think of the things where prices have come down. Look at telecommunications, cell phones. Your cell phones work very, very well, and the prices have come down. Why is it that health care, something as essential as health care, has gone up faster than anything else in the economy? Additionally, we have more entitlements that we've added through votes for expanding Medicare. It's actually increased the cost of health care and made it harder to afford.
Thank you very much. Now, a question from Ms. Anderson.
This question is for Mr. Isakson, but I would like the other two candidates to respond. I want to read this from your website. Is in the geopolitical and environmental interests of the United States to reduce our dependence upon imported foreign oil. Does that mean that you favor more offshore drilling? And if so, are you concerned that what recently happened in the Gulf could happen again?
Well, first of all, we need to reduce our dependence on foreign imported oil. Right now, we're financing Chavez and Ahmadinejad, two of our worst enemies, because they have so much petroleum. I think we ought to drill offshore on our own resources. I think we ought to explore on the continent of the United States, the continental territory of the United States. I think we ought to equalize incentives so all forms of renewable energy are used in this country. And in particular, the most powerful of all being nuclear energy, which is carbon neutral, doesn't generate any carbon, safe and is reliable, and produces electricity over a long period of time. We've just gotten reactors 3 and 4 approved for Plant Vogtle in Augusta. Hopefully we'll continue to do more of that so we can reduce carbon and reduce the cost of electricity by using renewable energy that's safe and reliable.
Lori Geary, a question for any of the panelists?
This is for all three of you because this is an issue that's been in the news this week quite a bit. Juan Williams was fired from NPR this week for some comments that he made on Fox News. But it's opened up this whole debate about whether or not the federal government should be in the business of public broadcasting. And I asked this question considering we're at Georgia Public Broadcasting. But is that an acceptable way to spend taxpayer funds? Mr. Donovan, we'll start with you.
Thank you. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the government should be involved in broadcast. So no, it is not an acceptable way to spend taxpayer funds. The initial funding for public broadcast, both radio and TV, was to get it up and running. But it continues to fund. In fact, the numbers I looked at a couple years ago showed it the government actually funds about 15% to 20% of the total cost. Now you'll have to check out my facts on that. But what that means is it would not be that much more money that the public broadcast stations would have to find to continue to broadcast, to continue to do the job that they do well. And I happen to enjoy public broadcast myself. But it is inappropriate, particularly for a government that is already broke, to continue to be involved in this area.
Mr. Thurmond, that Juan Williams controversy?
Well, I think it is an appropriate expenditure. I grew up in rural Georgia, and I benefited from Georgia Public Broadcasting throughout my life. Watching educational programming. And you know, city folk may have other resources, but when you live in rural Georgia, you need a resource like Georgia Public Broadcasting that does so much to educate our children and inform our population. It's a good expenditure. It's not even an expenditure. It's an investment in the future of this state and the future of this nation, and I would continue to support it.
And Mr. Isakson.
Well, what we've got to do on all appropriations of the Congress of the United States, not just NPR or public television or public radio, but everything we do, every budget unit, is measure the accountability and is this the best way to be spending our money, particularly if we're borrowing money against our children's future. So whether it's public television, public radio, or anything else that's funded by the federal government in whole or in part, if we would pass the Isakson bill, which is the biennial budget, which requires oversight and justification every even-numbered year for every appropriation, then those things that should be appropriated that we can afford, we would, and those we can do without would not.
Okay, Jim Galloway, your next question.
Question for Mr. Donovan. In one of your radio ads, I'm sorry, in a recent interview, you said that for now, you would support a woman's right to abortion. That seems a little iffy. What did you mean by that?
Yes, I was taken a bit out of context. Now, let me state that, first of all, I am working for a world where there are no unwanted children and no unwanted pregnancies. The Libertarian Platform specifically states no taxpayer funding for abortions. I work for a world where we make better choices with our lives, and what I had to say to that. I got cornered into making that answer, actually, Mr. Galloway. So,
but do you support a woman's right to abortion?
My personal opinion is that it's the wrong thing to do, and I would not allow taxpayer funding to go towards an abortion.
Okay, Meredith Anderson.
Speak to that, please, on the record.
Go right ahead.
I believe that abortion should be rare and safe, and that is a decision between a woman, her physician, and her pastor, rabbi, or minister. It is important that we maintain this right, and as the next U.S. Senator, I will work to protect it as a senator from the state of Georgia.
If you wish, Mr. Isakson, you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I don't want to be the odd man out, so of course.
Okay, all right.
I don't support government funding of abortions. I don't support abortion on any circumstance except in the case of rape, incest, and the life of the mother.
Okay. Okay, Meredith Anderson, you have another question.
I do. I would like to go back to the questions that our viewers submitted before I came up here. Ashley in Norcross has this to say: I'm concerned about Georgia's national reputation, which has the power to make or break our economic future. Do you think that our national reputation has harmed us, and what will you do to improve our standing to the rest of the nation? And I'll start with you, Mr. Thurmond.
I'm proud that just this past 2 weeks ago, ABC Evening News focused on our Georgia Works initiative and stated that Georgia was leading the nation, cracking the code, and figuring out how to get unemployed Americans back to work. I think my election and the continued work here would speak volumes, and I don't believe we have a bad reputation. I don't buy into the northern view of what Georgia is. Georgia is a great state. Georgia is a state of opportunity. I stand here today as an elected official statewide and a candidate for the U.S. Senate. That speaks to the greatness of Georgia and the people who live here, and I don't buy into the notion that we have a bad reputation nationally.
Mr. Donovan.
Thank you. I don't have the luck to have been born here in Georgia. Georgia is my 9th state, but it is my chosen state, my wife's chosen state, and our daughter's chosen state. I think Georgia has everything. I think we have everything from the coastal areas to the mountain areas. I think it's a beautiful state. I think we have an opportunity. We are geopolitically situated for both an economic renaissance here and an ideological renaissance. Georgia, by voting in the first libertarian senator, will fire a political shot that will be heard around the world. And we will say we are done doing business as usual. We're done with the status quo, and we are done with expanding government. We trust Georgians, and we want representation that trusts Georgians as well.
And Senator Isakson.
Well, I don't think we have a bad reputation either. In fact, we've got 2 recent incidents that just certify what a great state Georgia is. Number one, the Gwinnett County public school system was just chosen the best public school system in the United States. In fact, Michael's sister, Barbara Archibald, and I served on the State Board of Education when we granted the waiver to Gwinnett County to introduce the Gateway program, which was the precursor to testing, end-of-course testing like No Child Left Behind does, which was given in this presentation in New York to be the credit that Gwinnett County had for becoming the best public school system in America. And then National Cash Register. In a difficult recession year, they left Ohio, came to Georgia, both in Atlanta and Columbus, because of our jobs program, because of our Chamber of Commerce, because of our pro-business environment. I think we've got a great state that can be even better, and I'll continue to make this Georgia that we all love even better in my 2nd term in the Senate.
Okay, Jim, you have another question.
Yes, one for all 3. We'll start with Mr. Isakson again. If Republicans take control of the U.S. House, deficit reduction is likely to become an immediate issue. How do Republicans get to an agreement with the Democratic president without repeating a shutdown of the federal government like we had in 1994, or should we seek out that shutdown?
Well, I think as long as you've got men and women deployed in harm's way in Afghanistan, the last thing in the world is you shut down the support system for those men and women. So I would not want to do that. On the same token, it is time we got back to our spending that we had prior to this current administration and even prior to the last administration of President Bush. I voted against President Bush's 2003 Omnibus Appropriations Act, and I voted against the first one of President Obama. I have tried to fight for fiscal soundness everywhere I could. Right now, the best thing we should do is set the 2008 budget caps as the new caps for the next budget year we go into, because that would reduce spending by $600 billion in the first year of appropriation after it was established. That's the way you have to do it, with tough love.
Mr. Thurmond.
Washington is broken. You ask working men and women They are frustrated, they are angry, and they're upset that the issues that are most important to them are not being addressed. The gamesmanship that goes on in Washington every day, Republican, Democrats, and Independents jockeying for an endless type of positioning that we regular folk don't understand, has to end. What we need to do is elect senators and congressmen and people to Washington who will move beyond partisan affiliation, move beyond geographical kind of considerations, and work for the best interest of the American people. Shutting down the government just to gain political advantage would be a wrong thing to do. It was wrong when it happened before. It would be wrong then. Send me to Washington. I will build a winning coalition that will get America working, get control of the deficit, and provide quality education for our children.
And Mr. Donovan.
Will Rogers once said that when Congress is in session, nobody's wallet is safe. I remember when the government shut down during the Clinton administration, and the world did not come to an end. I think that we should look at this word bipartisan, and we've come to accept it as a good word. It doesn't necessarily mean good. It might mean twice as bad, and oftentimes it does. We need to stop looking to the government for solutions. We need to stop seeing the government as our savior. Government is the problem. It is never the solution. And I'd like to point out about these things, these spending cuts. You know, people who are in government, they always want to point to the cuts that they've made. But we see that the national debt continues to grow. They want us to focus on the cuts, this little space down here. But we're paying for all of this. And in fact, I can't quite get my hand up high enough to say just how much we're paying for. We need to stop focusing on the small stuff and start looking at the big stuff. We keep talking about rearranging the deck chairs as the ship goes down, and I think we need to focus on the reason why the ship is sinking.
Okay, Lori, you get the next question.
My question goes to Senator Isakson. The city of Atlanta this week received some money for a streetcar project, but if you look at the overall picture, Georgia has not received much federal money compared to Florida or North Carolina. My question is, why have you and other members of the delegation not been able to secure more money for Georgia when it comes to easing gridlock, especially here in Metro Atlanta?
Well, I don't know that I would agree to your summation about what we haven't done. We'll go back to Jim Galloway's question on earmarking or prioritizing. A lot of the capital funds that go into transportation are coming from designated trust funds, where it's the job of the representatives and the senators to prioritize based on the Transportation Improvement Plan, which is required by all APDCs in the state. I've spent a lot of time as the member of the Transportation Committee in the House and now the Commerce Committee. The fifth runway at Hartsfield International Airport in part comes from a designated trust fund for passenger facility charges that are paid. I worked for that and got that. Have done the same thing on projects for highway construction that come out of the Motor Fuel Fund, which is the Highway Trust Fund. So I would disagree that Georgia's congressional delegation hasn't done a good job of procuring those money. But we prioritized it within the designated funds, not as borrowed debt or add-ons to the budget.
Meredith, your question.
This question is for Mr. Thurmond. The Medical College of Georgia is a vital fixture in Augusta, just like the University of Georgia is a vital fixture in Athens. MCG has a presence in Athens, an expanding presence in Athens. And there's some concern in my area, why is MCG expanding in Athens when it could expand in Augusta? So what is your response to that?
Well, actually, I have divided loyalties. I went to college in Augusta, too, although I'm born and raised in Athens. I think we should look at it much more from a statewide perspective and a regional perspective. There is a shortage of medical practitioners in Georgia, across the South, and across this nation. We shouldn't be as parochial as to think it's just about Augusta or Athens. Really, we're trying to increase the number of physicians that will serve America and Georgia. And one of the things that I'm so excited about the new medical school in Athens is that for every one physician, there are 14 support medical personnel. During the recession, the one area that continued to grow was health and allied health. I think this creates more opportunities for Athens and Augusta, as well as the entire state of Georgia.
Okay, Jim, you have another question?
This one's for all three again. We haven't addressed the topic of immigration yet. And the crux of any attempt at reform has been what to do with 12 million human beings, men, women, and children, living in the U.S. illegally. What do we do with them? Many have talked about an earned path to citizenship for them. Does that amount to amnesty? And if it does, then what measures should we take to expel them? Mr. Donovan, start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Galloway. As the grandson of immigrants, I began in an immigrant working class neighborhood. As someone who crosses the border all the time as part of my work. As someone who is married to an immigrant, and I've been through the green card process. It's arduous and basically very, very difficult. I want to make it clear that I do not support amnesty. I don't support a fast track to citizenship. I think that we should be enforcing the laws that we have. We can enforce those laws on employers. We can take the laws that we have, the federal government is supposed to be supporting or securing our border, but there's a proper way to do that. As you said, we need to think about these people, a humane way to do this. I think we need to focus on police patrols there, border patrols, not soldiers on the border. The long-term solution here is to do what was suggested in the 18th century. We need to be looking at having rich neighbors. And the way to do that is to take a leadership role ourselves. What are we doing that is holding back our economy, and what are other economies doing that is following us into bad economics?
Thank you. Mr. Isakson, the immigration quandary.
Well, I offered what was known as the Isakson Trigger Amendment 5 years ago to the Immigration Modernization Bill that was introduced, and that said that securing the border to the southwest with Mexico is absolutely essential before you do any other reform. A part of that amendment was a biometrically secure visa to come into the United States. Right now, all the visas to come in, there are 43 different types. They're paper and pencilable, they're easily forgeable, and therefore we've got 12 million people here illegally who have a document that looks like they're legal, but they're not. If you had one secured to a retina scan or a fingerprint, you would absolutely end people staying here under false identification. The four things that have to be done to secure the border with Mexico are 6,000 Border Patrol agents, eyes in the sky, predator drones with the continuous surveillance on the border, detention cells to end the practice of catch and release, and most importantly of all, barriers to funnel people in high-density population areas like we have in San Diego across the border so you can control immigration into the country.
Thank you. Mr. Thurmond.
Think about it. We talked about now immigration. We've talked about transportation. We've talked about the economy. And all three of those key issues, and it's not all Johnny's fault because he's a good man, but the job is not getting done in Washington. We can continue to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, and we're not going to get it. You asked about transportation. I will have a seat at the table. We can get transportation funding. Atlanta, Georgia, basically been left at the transit station, the truth be told. We can't get the Savannah Harbor deepened. What I'm asking for is an opportunity. If we continue to do the same thing over, you're going to get the same results. We need to send someone to Washington who will build a coalition, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Independent, Tea Party, Coffee Party, and focus on America and not on partisan politics, and we can get this country moving again, and we'll get 15 million Americans back to work, and we'll get 600,000 Americans back to work through America Works within the first 90 days.
Thank you, Mr. Thurmond. Lori, your next question.
I just want to ask all three of you this. Shouldn't be a short answer, but if you had to give President Obama a grade on a scale of A through F, what would his report card look like? And I want to start with Mr. Thurmond as the Democrat in the race.
And we're getting short on time, so 30 seconds for this response, please.
Well, I'll give the president a C+ because he worked so hard. The only reason he doesn't have a higher grade is that he has faced and been involved in an extremely partisan environment. I give Congress a D because there's been very little support. What has really happened is that we've been engaged in this tug of war, this fight over political turf. President Obama went to Washington to seek a nonpartisan environment, to pursue a nonpartisan agenda. And quite frankly, he was surprised by the depth of partisanship that he found. What we need to do is get back to basics. Let's put America first, not parties, not partisan positions, but America.
Mr. Isakson.
You don't give grades at the midterm, you give them at the end of the whole term. There's 2 more years left to go in the term, but I would have to say this: if this midterm election, the American people speak out like I hear them speak, and if President Obama does not get the message that we need to reduce spending, we need to reduce the deficit, we need to find ways to stop the runaway deficit that we have in this country, then he'll get an F at the end of that term.
And Mr. Donovan.
I listened to President Obama as he campaigned. He hasn't really surprised me, except that he promised he would get our troops out of combat. We're still in combat. He has gone with stimulus. I knew that he would do that. That was a very, very big mistake. If I were to grade him on that alone, I would give him a failing grade.
Okay.
But that, please.
We're really tight on time right now.
But the only thing I'm saying is...
just real 15 seconds.
We need to be fair about it. The man inherited a mess that took 8 years to create. We inherited a surplus. He turned it into a deficit. And between the president and Congress, it's not about any of them. It's about all of us working together as Americans, which will solve the problems of this nation.
Okay, Ms. Anderson, you'll get our last question, and can you direct it to a single candidate, please?
Sure. Mr. Isakson, as a politician who has 20 years experience in the real estate business, what are your suggestions to get us out of this housing crisis, and are we even close?
Bringing jobs back will be the most important thing we can do to stabilize housing, and there are 3 things you do to bring jobs back. Number 1, most importantly, you need to extend current tax rates a minimum of 3 years so small business knows what their taxes are going to be. That's why they're not expanding jobs. We need to make sure regulation is fair so the playing field's level, but let competition dictate winners and losers. We've got too much regulation being piled on right now. And lastly, we've got to begin to reduce the debt so we don't have inflation looming over the horizon to stifle small business. If we do that, housing will come back because jobs come back. And when jobs come back, the economy will be better.
Okay, we've got an extra 30 seconds. Who wants it?
I'll take it.
Okay, go ahead.
We have to remember what caused the housing crisis. It was easy credit that was given out by the government. You cannot live on fake credit. If you're living on credit cards, you're living a lie. Sooner or later, you're going to have to pay the bill. If you live beyond your means, at some point you're going to have to live below your means. We have not paid that price yet. Government continues to pick the winners and losers. They continue to give credits. Credits, by the way, are spending as well. We can't afford to continue to interfere in the market.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. We're all out of time for our questions. Each of the candidates in the election for United States Senate will now have 60 seconds for a closing statement. By random selection, our first closing statement comes from Mike Thurmond.
First, I would like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for hosting this very important debate. It is critical that the people of this state hear from the candidates. Secondly, I'm asking for your prayers, your votes, and your support. Let us build a winning coalition of Georgians. Let us pursue a new vision for this state. Not North Georgia, South Georgia, not black, white, Hispanic, or Asian, not even Republican and Democrat when it comes to the education of our children. Let us work together to build one Georgia, one America that is as we pledged that it would always be, under God, indivisible, and an America that will offer liberty, justice, and good jobs for all. Thank you.
Mr. Isakson, your closing statement.
Well, I want to thank Georgia Public Broadcasting and the Atlanta Press Club for making this debate possible tonight. I want to commend Chuck Donovan and Mike Thurmond on offering themselves for public office. That participation is what democracy is all about in this great republic of ours. But our nation is at a crossroads. There are 2 philosophies in Washington, D.C. that are on a collision course. One of them is a philosophy that believes government knows the solution to most problems, if not all. The other is one that I share. Belief in the power of the individual, the private sector, entrepreneurship, and free enterprise. I will work in the next 6 years as I have in the past to empower the private sector, to see to it regulations fair but not oppressive, taxes remain low, and we begin to reduce the debt and the deficit on the children and grandchildren of our future. I want to thank you for watching tonight. I want to thank the people of the United States for their support of all of us, and I want to ask the good Lord to bless this great country, the United States of America.
And Mr. Donovan, make the closing argument.
Thank you very much. I am standing against 2 career politicians. When it comes to solutions, they are 2 peas in the same pod. They believe in government solutions, and I want you to know that government is never the solution. Government is always the problem. I have no special interests that back me. I have a free vote. I know how to say no. I can say no to special interests. I know how to say no to lobbyists. I know how to say no to increasing the size of government. I know how to say no to more debt. And I know how to say yes to Georgia businesses and set them free so that they can create the jobs that we need. I know how to say yes to Georgia families and let them decide how to educate their children as they see fit. I'm looking for your yes on November 2nd. I ask you for your vote. And I'm asking for one more yes. Johnny, Mike, I happen to be working Monday through Thursday, but I'm off on Friday and Saturday, and I'd really like to have another debate. I think the voters would like to see it, and I'll have a debate with you gentlemen anytime that you see fit on Friday or Saturday.
I'm there.
Okay. All right. That concludes our debate. A reminder that general elections will be Tuesday, November 2nd, and early voting ends this Friday, October 29th. Our thanks to the candidates, Chuck Donovan, Johnny Isakson, Mike Thurmond, and also to our panel of journalists, Meredith Anderson, Jim Galloway, and Lori Geary. We'd also like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging this debate. For more information about the Atlanta Press Club, you may visit atlantapressclub.org. The debates that air on Georgia Public Broadcasting will be archived on the Press Club's website. This broadcast has been streamed live and will be available on demand on GPB's website, gpb.org. I'm Morris Diggs. Thanks for joining us for this general election debate. Have a great evening and get out and vote.
The Atlanta Press Club Debate Series is made possible in part by donations from the late Tom Watson Brown and Emory University.